Thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you're about to see another interesting presentation mentioning variable fonts, among other things. I'm pleased to introduce Simon Cozens. He's a freelance font engineer based in the UK, and he has specialized for several years in supporting scripts with complex layout requirements. He's also developed an open source typesetting engine called Sile, with which you can typeset complete books. And he's also the author of Fonts and Layout for Global Scripts, which is looking to be a really useful source for. But it's kind of an alternative to reading about OpenType and so on from the spec. It's really nicely written. It's sort of in progress and accepting contributions, and it's a useful place to find out more about how fonts work. In this talk, Simon's going to talk about how variable fonts are built, in particular using some new ideas other than using the standard apps, FontLab, RoboFont, and Glyphs, and that masters-based toolchain, in a way that exposes more of the power of what the OpenType specification, the variation specification, allows. And have I covered everything there, Simon?
Yeah, that's about it. We've got a fairly short video. It's about a 15-minute video, and then I'll expand a bit on that afterwards, and then we'll have some discussion.
Hello everyone, my name's Simon Cozens. I'm a font engineer, and I specialise in fonts with complex layout requirements. And that means that I spend most of my working life in the GPOS and G subtables, and I don't tend to get involved in the design at all. Although recently I did try and design a font. Here it is. It's an Arabic font. It's a bit of a dummy font. It's not intended to be a good design. It's called Alpha the mouse because the dots on the top of the letter T reminded me of a certain configuration of circles. But it's actually designed to have a particular problem. And the problem is this, that as it gets bolder but not particularly wider, when you have high letters either side of the T, then these dots collide with it. And I wanted to create that particular problem because I wanted to solve it in a particular way, which is here, that as it gets past a certain threshold point, we move the dots up out of the way. And again, from a design perspective, that might not be something that you really want to do with this script, but I wanted to create this particular technical challenge. Now, you might have already seen an example by Just van Rossum of a variable font that changes its kerning quite drastically as it goes through the design space. Well, this is something similar. But it is a little bit different. In particular, I only want this T to change in a particular context, when there are these tall letters on one side of it or the other. So this isn't just a straight kerning rule. For one thing, it's not a horizontal change, it's a vertical change. And it's the kind of thing that in a static font you would do by writing a manual rule in your feature rules. Now, to implement this in a variable font is a bit of a challenge, and to understand why, we need to look a little bit about how variable fonts are built and if there is a different way that we can build them. Way back in 2016, when variable fonts were announced, there was a rush to get a compiler available that would produce these variable fonts for us. And there were different strategies that could have been used to produce this compiler. And the way that it went in the end, as you can see from this quote from Reed Roberts, was that we used the existing tools to build an OpenType font for each master that's defined in the design, and then we run a script to merge the master designs into a variable font. What does this mean? Well, we begin with our source, let's say a glyphs file, a FontNub file, or a set of UFOs, and these tend to have a feature file. The first thing that we do in order to generate a variable font, and this is using the FontMake, the open source toolchain for font generation, is to create a design space file. And this sets out the parameters of the design space, where the masters are located on it, and it also contains a set of rules about how some of the features can change as they go along that design space. The next thing that we do is we turn each master into its own separate UFO font and save it in UFO format. We load it again and we turn each of those fonts into a TrueType font. Well, this is easy. This is something that we've known how to do, so it wasn't an additional burden to turn our masters into individual TrueType fonts, and then all that we needed to do was put them together again at the end. So it was very quick to produce a variable font compiler this way. You take the outline data, the glyph table of your default master, you put that into your variable font, and then you take the difference between the outlines for each of the other masters and you put those into the gvar table. And then when it comes to the layout, you take the rules from the design space file, you take the gsub and the gpos information from each of the TTFs that we've generated at each point in the design space, and then you very cleverly merge those together into a variable gsub and gpos table. But there is a problem with this, which is that we only have one feature file in the source, and we're generating 4 gsub and gpos tables, in this case for 4 masters, from that one feature file. When we do that, FontMake can vary certain things for us. If we have a kerning rule, then it knows to extract the kerning information from the source and to place different kerning values in each of the masters. And when those master TTFs are generated, we can then turn those different kerning locations in the design space into a single gpos table, into a variable gpos table. So that works very well. Anchors, when you define anchors in your individual masters, the same thing can happen. Those are propagated down to the UFOs, they're then propagated down to the individual TTFs, and we can create variable anchors that way. So the example that you saw from Joost van Rossum can be done quite simply. We can create 4 masters, we can have our regular and we can have our bold, and then we create these 2 intermediate masters where there's a little bit of kerning and then there's kerning that pushes the 2 glyphs apart. The problem with this, though, is that those 2 intermediate masters, those masters in the middle, really aren't part of the design. So there's a lot of repetition here. They're only there to support the fact that we want to do something in this kern rule. So one kern rule has turned a 2-master font into a 4-master font. And worse than that, when it comes to this situation that we created in our Arabic font, where we want to do something contextual and something vertical and something that normally you would do with a manually created feature rule, there's no way to specify how that varies across the design space. You can't put one pos rule into one of your output masters and one pos rule into another of your output masters and have a way to merge them together, because it's all being generated from this single feature file at the top. But what if instead of doing that, we had a way of specifying how a feature could vary across the design space. Now, if we could do that, we could go straight from our variable feature file to variable layout in the font at the bottom. We could create our variable font directly from the rules that we've put in at the top. And in fact, if we could do that, we wouldn't need to generate a set of rules in the design space, because the rules would already be embedded in our variable feature file. In fact, we wouldn't really need to generate the design space at all, because all of the information where things are located on the design space is already contained in the sources that we have. And come to think of it, we wouldn't need to extract all the outlines independently into separate UFOs and separate TTFs. We could just take the outlines straight from the source, take the outline of the regular format, put that into the glyph table, and then put all the differences from the default master into the G-file table. So this, to me, looks a lot simpler than doing this. It looks a bit more straightforward, and it's avoiding a lot of the toing and froing, a lot of the conversion that happens in the merge strategy for creating variable fonts. Here we've taken a single source file, we've generated a UFO for each master, we've generated a TTF for each master, and then finally we've generated the variable font, which was the thing that we were trying to do all along. We've written 10 different files when all we wanted was one. So this variable first strategy, as well as allowing us to create variable layout of the kind that we wanted at the beginning, turns out to be a lot simpler. And in fact, because it's a lot simpler, it's also a lot faster. When in my experiments I'm finding that it's around 3 to 4 times faster than the existing way of doing things. But that's not the reason that I started this. As you remember, the reason I started was to create a truly variable layout without requiring additional masters, without requiring these intermediate layers, and to be able to specify complex layout rules that vary across the design space. So at the end of it all, I got my mouse. Where is this at the moment, and where is it all going? Well, you can get a copy of the variable font builder, which builds directly to variable fonts, from a project called Babel font on my GitHub repository. And that actually uses my own feature syntax, which is not related to the Adobe feature syntax, and varies things that way. But for this to become part of the mainstream way in which we develop variable fonts, then we need that variable feature syntax to be accepted. And so myself and Zachary Schwern have proposed some syntax for how to write rules that vary across the design space. And those, at the time of recording this, are been drafted as a proposal to the Adobe feature syntax. They're being discussed right now, and there's an implementation in Font Tools where you can add these kind of variable kerning rules and variable contextual kerning rules using this syntax. And I'm hoping that this proves the concept of generating variable fonts directly, rather than going through this whole sort of split up and merge. We take the simpler path of variable layout and then directly generating a variable font from the source. It's simpler, it's faster, although it does require us to essentially start again and rewrite our tools. So we're currently having discussions about the future direction of font make and the open source font generation toolchain. but I would very much hope that going variable first will be a part of that in the future, as it allows us to unlock these possibilities for generating variable layout. Thank you very much for listening to this talk. I'll be around to answer any questions that you have, and I'd like also to thank Google Fonts for the way that they've supported the research and the development that have gone into this. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much for that, Simon. That was fascinating.
Okay, good.
I must say, on a personal level, it was apparent to me when I was implementing the VF spec in Samsa and some other tools, how different it was to the kind of thing you might expect from watching, from understanding how variable fonts are built in glyphs and in UFOs and FontMake. It's apparent that you could do a lot more, and it's one of the things that Underwear realized as well.
Yes.
You can do a lot more than use a set of masters to produce interpolations between them. So this is really great. And there's no real downside, is there? I mean, apart from writing new tools and learning new tools, I don't think there's a downside, because the variable fonts are smaller in the end as well, because they don't need to record these intermediate positions for all these glyphs that are not really needed.
Yeah, exactly. You can compress stuff. I mean, this is what Underwear have done. Have taken the way that glyphs vary and kind of built on top of that. And what I'm trying to do now is sort of do the same thing for the way that layout can vary. And I showed you the sort of the two examples, the Arabic example and the Latin example. And I don't know kind of where people are going to take this. I'm not a designer, so I'm not somebody who is able to sort of see the potential really in this aesthetically. But I think there are probably a lot of very cool things that you can do by varying the layout across the design space like that.
Yeah, you're very much exposing the power that's in that variable font engine, has been all along since
exactly
since its invention in the 90s even. Yeah, that's great. And that diagram was fascinating as well. And I think it was fair, the comparison of the complexity of how you have to combine all these masters that are all redundant, and with the simplicity of just having sources for the information that is required.
Yeah, I mean, we're comparing kind of FontMake, the open source tooling. I don't know how font editors like Glyphs produce a variable font. They might be doing it more this sort of direct way. But I'm trying to make that open source tool chain better and faster and more flexible. And even then, even in the font editors, they haven't yet got the ability to vary the layout in the way that we're talking about.
Yeah, and also, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, the reason I sort of came up with this to begin with is that I'm writing a font layout editor. So the way that my work operates, I will work alongside a designer, and they will own the source file of the outlines, and I'll own the layout, and we'll work separately. And so I've been writing a tool to do that layout visually. So it would take a source file, and then you could sort of draw where you want things to go and how you want them to move across the design space. And I would then need to produce a variable font at the end of that. And that's why I needed, to take a font, to vary it, and then to export it like that.
And you've also been working on tools to produce those variable fonts much quicker.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. I mean, like I said, I wanted to do it purely because of the things that I needed to do with layout. But I showed it to some people, and they said, "Oh, that's 3 times faster." And suddenly it got into a conversation about how quickly we can build fonts. And fair enough, for things like CJK projects, for projects with huge number of masters where you're got multiple axes going on, then it can get very slow. And I know people who are waiting 20-30 minutes to build a font, and that's not fun for anyone. So as soon as I said, I can make it 3 times faster, it sort of, all the business about layout went away, and it turned into a race. And how much quicker can we make the existing tools, because people would rather keep the tools that they've got than throw everything out and start again. But yeah, no, right now I'm investigating working with Rust, which is a different programming language, and trying to re-implement a font builder in Rust. And this morning I did manage to get a variable font built. And it processed, I think it was an 8 master 3000 glyph variable font in under a second. So
Wow.
that will, and it's doing it in this variable first way.
For
So
people that don't know, how long it would take, how long would that have taken using FontMake?
Oh, I don't 10 minutes.
Yeah, it's massive. It's in the factor of hundreds or 1,000 times faster.
Yeah. But I mean, the next step for this, in terms of the layout, I showed you a little bit of the syntax. I didn't really go into how we're going to vary our layout, because that's something that we're discussing along with Adobe to produce a syntax for how you can specify rules that vary across the design space. So there is a link to where that discussion is happening. And so you can sort of start to get to grips with it there. And I've done Erwin says that he's got this working in Font Creator already, so that's fantastic.
Ah, very good. For those who are sort of not convinced about why it's important to get rid of redundant sources, I think just if you start to add these extra sources into your project that are not really required, you then have this disincentive to ever change that position of where does that TV kern happen, because you've got these sources to maintain forever. If you can avoid having them in the first place, you're just then editing one line of FEA code, and you're done. You can just decide, no, it should be flipping a little bit earlier, a little bit later. You can make lots of tests with no need to create all these extra sources. It's really,
again, if you think about the distinction that I'm using, the designer designs his glyphs in the glyph editor, and then I come along in the layout editor and I put those rules into the layout.
We've got a question about the syntax. If you could explain that a bit more from Pathum Ego Dawata.
Yep. So the OpenType allows us to vary layout in two ways. One is kind of any numbers that are in the GPOS table. So that's anchors, positioning rules, so kerning and things like that, or value records where you can move things up and down and left and right. They need to be able to vary across the design space. So what I've said is that wherever you can put a number, so think about a kern rule, think, pos AV minus 120 or whatever. Wherever you can put a number, you can put brackets, and then axis location equals the value at that place. It's kind of hard to tell you about the syntax, but if you have a look at that link, it will make it clear. The other thing that we can do is put in rules that only fire at certain places of the design space. So you can have features that apply, between certain widths or between certain weights and so on, and don't apply in other cases. So there's just two changes to the feature syntax, which would allow all of that to happen.
Thanks. And I wasn't quite clear if you think FontMake will evolve to work this way, or are you proposing that people move to a new font building tool, or both? Is it both could work this way?
Well, I think this is why I'm sort of trying to raise the awareness of this, and then as people build more interesting things with layout and do produce fonts that vary across the layout, across the design space, then it will sort of provide more impetus for FontMake to support that. And whether that happens through going to Rust or going to Babel font or whatever, I don't really mind. I think, between us talking with some of the FontMake developers, there's a sort of grudging realization that the future is going to be Rust, simply for the speed. But obviously nobody wants to give up on a project that works well and is stable and does more or less what we want until there's a real pressing need for it.
Right, and I've seen some discussions which have talked about using Rust for those very performance-intensive parts and gluing it all together with Python and allowing all those old Python functions to work just as they always have.
Yeah. So there's lots of different experiments going on at the moment about how we can make FontMake faster. But I would like to see more questions about how we can make FontMake expose more of these variable functionality.
We've got a question from Mamoun Sakal. As a designer, I'm used to working visually and refining my work by looking at the results and improving them. Is this aspect missing in this method?
Well, I would say this is one of the reasons why I have come up with this method, is because at the moment it's what I wanted to create was a visual editor for layout, similar to Microsoft Vault, and it's on its way. There are bits of it that work, but with the ability to change that layout and vary that layout, not just between your masters, but also in the middle as well. So you can preview how your layout would look across the whole of the design space and say, oh, actually, at this point, I need to change something and put in, another value of your rule. So it would, I think this is the only way to work more visually, unless you want to be putting in tons of masters to support each individual rule.
And for people that like to work in all-in-one tools like FontLab and Glyphs, what do you think the process would be about to get those apps to working as efficiently? Would you be willing to? Are you keen to have that flowing into them as well?
We've had conversations about variable syntax with all of these people, and we've had conversations. I've certainly been talking with the Glyphs folk about getting this visual layout editor that I've been writing some of the ideas of that at least into Glyphs. And again, as we build fonts in this different way, I think that enables more of this sort of previewing and visual layout.
Cool. Dave Crossland requests that you tell the story of Mark Foley caching. I'm not sure what he's referring to there. Maybe you know.
Yeah. So Mark was trying to. We have a tool called GF Builder, which runs FontMake and then does another. Also produces static instances and other fix-ups that you might need to do as part of building a family of fonts. And he only wanted this to run. He only wanted it to run FontMake if the variable font hadn't changed, and then do the subsetting and everything else afterwards. So normally, you run FontMake, you produce your static instances, but if your variable font hasn't changed since the last time you run it, you don't need to run FontMake again. So he spent some time writing a caching system to sort of check whether your UFO is the same as it was before, and if so, then skip the FontMake step, and that will make it nice and fast. And I showed him my Rust tool, where it was actually faster to rebuild the font from scratch than even to check whether the font had changed. Might as well just do it.
Right. So he was getting a 95% speed up or something, but you were getting way better than that.
Anyway, 1,000 times. Exactly.
Right. Yeah. We have a. Do you see Tamir's question?
Yeah.
There?
So
I'll just.
You.
Okay. I'll read out Tamir Hassan's question, which is: Hi Simon, thanks for your example with the TV pair being kerned across various weights. How is this done currently with the FontMake workflow? Does FontMake simply interpolate between the pairs instead of having a jump, or isn't it possible at all?
Okay, so this is a question really about how layout varies across the design space, and this is something that confused me for a while. How does it jump out like that? The way that variable fonts work these numbers, such as the kerning, always vary across a sort of linear function. It's sort of series of lines and triangles, and you can't stop and start and do a jump. So what is actually happening in that example and in my Arabic example is you have, for example, from say weight 200 to weight 600, it's 0, and then at 601 it goes up to kern of 120, and then it stays at 120 from there. So to make that work in FontMake, you would have to have 4 masters: your regular master, your sort of 600 master, your 601 master, and then your bold master over there. So yeah, it's making you create these extra masters just to support a single kerning rule. And if you think how that is not exactly scalable across the majority of the rules that you'd want to do.
Thanks. Yanni Beluz is, sorry for the pronunciation. Do you want to speak about that, about your contributions to the performance tracker for open source pipeline tools?
Yeah, this is something that Dalton Mag and myself have been working on. We've been trying to find a way to make all of the open source tools faster, including FontMake. And so we have a pipeline where a bunch of fonts are built, and there's a timer that sort of times how long it takes to do each one. And so we've been seeing how different changes and proposals to FontMake and to Babel font have been able to affect the speed of font building. And that's been very useful as giving us a baseline and saying, well, actually, we tried this thing, but it only gave us a 1% speed up, so why bother?
Mm. Tell us roughly what Babel font can do right now.
It can take a glyphs file, a set of UFOs, and even a basic FontLab file, and produce a variable font out of that. It will handle kerning, it will handle anchors, and it should handle most variable manual feature file rules. And if it doesn't, that's a bug, so please tell me about it. David says he's been doing something similar in the current workflow by substituting non-kerning alternates. Yup. Well, I think he's lost me, which is interesting. Do you want to share? Oh, can I share you a demo of the Rust font builder? I mean, I can. I don't know how interesting it would be to see. Well, let's do it anyway. I only literally got it working this morning, so there are several bugs, and the biggest problem is that it doesn't handle axis mapping yet, so AVAR mapping. But here we go. I'm hoping you can see this. Yeah, it looks like it's sharing. So here we have. That's all right. I've been asked to show a demo of the Rust thing. So this is Noto Sans, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 axes, and I think 3,500 glyphs. Let us see if we can build it. And where's the design space file? There it is. And notosans.tt, off we go. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3, go. Done. So that was 1.5 seconds that took to build Noto Sans. And if I open it with font goggles, yeah, some of it's varying and some of it isn't. So there's obviously, I mean, like I say, I only really got this working this morning. There are a few bugs to iron out, but that's the sort of speed that we'll be looking at. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of work still to do. I mean, I'd started rewriting these in Rust about 3 weeks ago, so it's by no means ready for prime time yet. And there's a lot of bugs, there's a lot to iron out, but it is going to, I think, dramatically change things. It's going to allow us to do complex building of variable fonts inside of font editors to do it in a really sort of interactive way. So it's going to be good. That's in Python. So this is something I started a couple of months ago, and then in the past few weeks, it's kind of almost become obsolete. So I've got a question. Yep. Yeah, I mean, you probably shouldn't do this. It's not something that I think is a good idea. I did think of it because I saw a sort of problem where I needed to shift the dots up a little bit in a font that I was working on. But no, this was really just a demonstration to see if we can make the technology work. And it wasn't possible to do that at the time. So that's why we needed a new way of building variable fonts to get that technology working. Exactly. And you could do things like having, randomized jerky fonts that go up and down and things like that. There's all sorts you could do with it. You could Peter says you could vary the line metrics across the design space. Now, again, I don't know if that's something that has been exposed yet. I'm not sure. Oh, well, some of the stuff in OS2 isn't very, but no, it's VMTX, isn't it? VVAR table that's got the vertical variations. MVAR should be used, says Peter. Yeah. So that would be done automatically. Actually, that would be built automatically. Yeah. Fill me in. What are they seeing? Yeah, maybe not. I mean, there would still be one single feature file. I mean, this is, in a sense, one of the problems of UFO is that you actually have multiple feature files in theory. You have a design space file, but in each of the UFOs you have a feature file, even though you can't really do very much with the one that's apart from the master. So this would replace that, I guess, with a single feature file that explains how that layout varies. Oh, follow me on Twitter. If I do something interesting, I tend to post it on Twitter. So Simon Cozens on Twitter. Okay, we've got one more question I've just noticed from Florian, who says, how do you expect feature definitions to be authored in the future, by myself in particular? Okay, I even though I'm writing a visual editor, I realize that I prefer working in text. And I have been using this syntax already in some of my work. He mentions Phi, which is a feature language that I use, that I came up with, which is sort of a bit more pluggable. It allows you to script the feature language in a way that Adobe feature syntax doesn't. So yeah, I do all of my work in Phi. It's now called Fez because Phi was really confusing. So yeah, I do all my work in Fez, even though I've written a visual editor for this stuff. But I hope that other people would have the visual. I imagine most designers would prefer working in a visual editor rather than trying to write rules in text. Yes, I've put them already in the chat. I've already put them in the chat. Yeah. Yeah, shall we? No, I think that's good. We'll head over to the Hangout room, and if people want to kind of know a bit more, we'll chat over there.